Today's title is called Coherence, Finding Your Center. This is a topic that we've seen a lot recently out there, and it seems that those who are coming into these vibrations, these energies, are hearing this message that it's time for the individual to come home within, to find their full and proper unique expression by moving into a better alignment. And we're going to be discussing what exactly this looks like, some examples, and how we can either be more or less coherent. I'm Ruth.
And I'm Adonis. This will be a fun topic. In a sense, we're getting back to the roots of what we talked about at the beginning of this series, right? It's a new word, new buzzword that's been kind of going around the spiritual community, but in a sense, it's still the same message that we've always been really getting at, which is to find our inner authority, to find our center, like we said in the title, right? This aspect of balancing ourselves internally so that we can connect to our own unique frequency and find our own inner master and the inner school, as opposed to seeking for answers outside of us in the external reality.
There's so many people that endlessly are seeking externally, whether regarding matters of love or belief, belonging, all these kinds of things that we chase, whether to do with reputation or career or material accumulation. There are endless ways for desire to be chased. And what we know, even from economics, is that desire itself is inexhaustible. So if we're going to be chasing desire, we will be chasing forever. And we will be continually telling ourselves stories about how the past wasn't good enough and how the future needs to be a certain way. And then when we are in the moment and we're facing the reality of our lives, these overlays come into it. And when these overlays, these stories or these memories get involved in the present moment, it not only takes us out of the present, but it causes decoherence. It causes our awareness to scatter. When our awareness scatters, we get lost in all kinds of illusions, whether in our emotions or in our mind, things that we tell ourselves to make ourselves feel unhappy or feel like whatever is happening right now is not good and it's something that we don't want. And while it may be the case that some of these thoughts contain information that are highlighting where we are not in alignment, most of these thoughts are another way to get lost in the noise, in the confusion. I think one of the biggest questions in the beginning is, what is coherence? What does that mean? We have to start with that one.
Yes. Well, the thing is with coherence or balance, equanimity, these types of things, is we have to understand that this is an inner to outer process, right? Our goal is to find a balance and take our place as a co-creator, a co-worker in this contract, and actually be consciously creating the reality around us. But there are steps to this, because first we need to balance ourselves internally so that we can even connect to our inner authentic frequency, our inner authority, our inner master, our inner God, all of these words that
Inner
we could
guru.
use. Inner guru, right? And before we can even do that, first we need to be in coherence ourselves with our own internal whims and our thoughts, our emotions, our actions. And that's where we really start, right? Because in a sense, we first have to balance the three centers that we have in our body, which actually correlate to what we have to balance on a macro scale. But first, as within, so without. This is a Hermetic term from Hermes Trismegistus, and it starts with the version of these three principles within our physical body, which relate to our intellect, our mind, our heart center, and our emotions, and then our physical body. And in this case, I like to use the word will. A lot of people say actions, and it's actually true. Actions is accurate in the sense of if our thoughts and our emotions line up with the actions, then we manifest. But our actions could be our own, or our actions could be from the shadow or from the ego. So I like to use the word will when we're talking about the balancing what is our actions in the physical body, to balance not just our actions, but our intentions with our own authentic internal intentions coming from our true self, not being masqueraded by the ego, so that at least we're in coherence in a way that is conscious. Because the other way would be unconscious. We could align our thoughts and our emotions egoically with what our ego wills, and we'll be creating unconsciously and out of balance in a macro scale, which is what the point is first we want to find this coherence internally, but the main goal is to actually have this coherence with the external reality through the spiritual work. And then that would intent would be the balance between the spirit, the soul, and the physical body. And in that we're looking at, in a macro sense, of a universal sense, us being a piece of the cosmic man, a piece of the Adam Kadmon. In that sense, that is his mind, his emotions, and his body, and our little fractal of that, of the greater being that we are within. So in that sense, it's the same balance, but first we have to have it in ourselves before we can start working about balancing that in the spiritual planes.
I think it's really interesting what you said about whose will we are acting from. A lot of people, when they hear the ego, they can become frightened, and they can say, oh no, that means I'm going to disappear. And the good news is you can never disappear. The awareness behind all of the phenomena, there's an eternal component behind it. So in that way, what is fundamental, what is permanent, what is not part of the ever-changing and impermanent aspect of reality must remain permanent. And when we bring this back down to the level of the individual, what does it mean? Well, one example we can look at is when you were a child, perhaps you loved to eat chocolate cake and ice cream, and you loved to play in the forest. And now that you're older, maybe you enjoy reading or singing or having some lovely moments with your friends and family. So we could ask, what happened to that child? Where are they now? And if we understand that we are constantly going through this never-ending process of metamorphosis, of change, then even if we transform and we come out of the shadow part of ourselves, essentially we don't disappear, we just move into another form. And if the shadow represents our wounds, our darkness, the things that hold us back, that cause us to act from a place of separation and selfishness, which leads to harm and pain for us internally, psychologically, and for everyone around us, wouldn't it be a good idea to begin to work to transform that shadow into light? And when we go through this transformation process, through a deep inner work, we don't disappear. Those negative qualities, those defects become transformed. And then our true will is able to be expressed. Let's take the example of when somebody is in a shadow of people pleasing. What is going on for them? There is a lot of fear, a lot of need for approval, and there's even a sense of worry about survival and safety, all of which logically, most of the time, do not apply to those situations that the person finds themselves in. It's something vestigial, it's something in the instinct that harkens back to when we lived in tribes and we needed to have this group around us to protect us from lions and wild animals and to make sure we could get enough berries and meat and things like that. And these fears do not correspond or correlate to a modern time when, say, you are trying to appease a family member and you want them to like you and you pretend that you like something that they're interested in, well, all of this can backfire because they will see that we are not being sincere. And we are not. We are acting from the shadow. We're acting from a place of fear. We are not expressing our true will. So when we talk about coherence being the full alignment of what we can understand through logic and our intuition, and what we can understand regarding our emotions, this information that comes in a more fluid way, and what we can understand regarding what is the true direction that our soul or our core, our essence is seeking to move in. And when it's masked by shadow, that will is the will of the shadow. So we have to be clear that the best coherence would be when we're working from what we could call divine will or pure will that comes from our essential part. However, even if we haven't finished fully doing the inner work to clear out the shadow, and this is a never-ending process, right? It keeps going. We continue to reflect and to understand ourselves in a deeper way. Even whilst this process is taking place, whatever will it is that we have should still be in alignment. So we're not going to be perfect, but we do want to still stay balanced as we work to clean out our will and find out what is the pure intention, that essential part of us that really relates to the expression of our soul, rather than what somebody told us, what society or our family, the environment programmed us to think is how we should behave and the things that we should pursue.
Yeah, I think it's important with what you were saying also to clarify what we really are, and starting to understand what we are in this scenario, because as you mentioned, there is this idea sometimes, for example, the lower ego, or we say the ego in general, but in case usually people are talking about the lower ego, people don't know there's a distinction between the two, but when we think of the ego as in the instinctual animal instincts that come around, and you'll have teachers, New Age teachers, for example, Ram Dass talks about how, the ego, we created it because it was necessary when we were at lower levels, like you said, to protect us from the animals and all these things, so that it wasn't necessarily a bad thing was created, which is absolutely accurate. The thing is that those things that we needed for survival were because in those states of being at a lower, more animalistic level in the animal kingdom, or even as a primitive human, we were not yet conscious. What happens is these things are now become vestigial, in the sense that, well, if one is in their awareness and in consciousness, then they don't need an instinct to say jump out of the way of a car that's coming towards them, right? If you're conscious, you would know to move out of the way of the car. So therefore, these instincts that were developed, these primitive instincts, they now are not only vestigial, but they also lead us to creating even more psychological defects from the impressions we take in if we don't process them properly. And that's the ego related to our lower self. Now, on top of that too, we start off identified with this witness. We think we are the thing, we are the person that we're inside. In this sense, that's where everyone starts, and there's not much we necessarily can do to wake up out of this state. I mean, if we're not still yet seeing our thoughts, usually there's a stroke of divinity or a spiritual inquietude that will bring us into the point where we begin to seek. And in that sense, now the observer may appear. And at this point, we are still identified with the witness and the person, but we can start to see our thoughts and see that there's something else there, almost like there's two people within us. And now, that's the first delineation, right? We have our lower self and we have our higher self, which is related to our soul. And in that sense, in the beginning, the first thing to do is to start listening to the observer over this witness at first. Because if we are just still identified with being the object, then we're not observing at all. But that's only just the first step, is to start to understand that we have the consciousness speaking through the higher self. Because the actual reality is is that all of these layers of ego and conditioning, and it even goes on beyond our solar system, but we will talk about it just in the sense of these two dualities that we have within this reality. It's not that we are the observer or the witness, but we are actually the awareness that's in both of these things, and even beyond that. The consciousness itself is a tool for us to perceive. And we perceive both as the lower self and as that higher self. So the next step to find balance and to find coherence is to actually not identify neither with the witness nor the observer, and to actually disidentify and realize that we are the pure awareness itself. And in that case, it's not that the ego disappears or you choose one ego over the other, or one ego is good or one ego is bad, as sometimes we'll make it out to look. It's that these are vehicles for the awareness to perceive, and we can use them at the appropriate times when they're useful to then understand and extract wisdom from the reality around us, to comprehend things and to experience. The ego at any level of reality is our vehicle to understand and perceive the experience that we're having. In fact, it is how we perceive, because if we were completely at 100% awareness and consciousness, then there's no duration and there's nothing there. You're all knowing, but there's no one there to know it.
There's no perception.
And when we're before we awaken and we're at the low state of being completely asleep in matter, then, well, the vehicle at that point is basically a machine, because there's no awareness to perceive through it. So things are happening to it. Of course, when we awaken, we remember the things that happened before. There's information in the brain of the vehicle, but there's still no perception. So the perception actually...
There was no perception.
Yes. The perception actually exists when both the manifestation and the awareness are together. So instead of... some people say we're a unity, or some people say that it's just duality. But the truth is this multidimensional aspect to perception that exists. And we've spoken about it before, but that it's not one or the other. It's not this, it's not that, but it's actually both and none. So it's also the illusion, but we need the illusion to have an experience. And that's why the being that we are all a part of, at whatever level that is, maybe even beyond the one that we perceive to be the being that we're a part of, that's why at some point the consciousness and that being decided to divide itself and manifest and create a reality for it to experience.
So how does that work then in terms of, let's say that you are on a spiritual path or part of a spiritual school, and perhaps you are studying or have studied some of the spiritual mysteries, and you learn about something called ego dissolution. What exactly does that mean in this context?
Right. So we like to use the word sometimes dissolution or death, which can scare a lot of people and scare the ego. And to an extent, some will say, well, the ego, we need the ego, and we can't perceive without it, which is true, which is what I just said. And the ego in itself is a point of gravity, right? It's a central point of gravity. It's a point within the construct that we perceive from. But the reason we use the word death, or we use dissolution, for example, a lot of times, because we use Gnostic teachings mostly, is because at the level of perception when a beginner comes in, the truth is that death is not really death. No, energy cannot be created nor destroyed. The death is more along the lines in terms of what we would say in a New Age teaching, but it's actually integration or transmutation.
Alchemy.
Yes, alchemy. What we do is we actually transform the lower ego, say, into a point of gravity within the higher body of the soul, and it becomes part of the higher ego. At some point, even, maybe we transmute that point of the higher ego into a part of the body of the celestial man, Adam Kadmon, and so on and so forth. So it's not, as long as there's perception and separation, there always is an ego. But the thing is that death is a new beginning. It's a new birth. We talk about in Christianity, they use the word born again. And in fact, we are. Something is born. When that ego dies, or we use that term, what really is that we're transforming that lower aspect into a higher aspect, and it's transforming. We could almost say like the egos are, if we're the egos inside of the being that we are, and the egos are beings inside of us, and as we awaken, it's reflected in them waking up inside of us, just as we are waking up in a being that is above us, also say doing the spiritual work, whatever that looks like in a superior dimension, right? So we're a reflection of, for example, the earth. We could say we're the earth neurons, and then the earth is an organ inside of the solar system. So everything is linked, as above, so below. So really, all of everything that we're doing, we could say our egos inside of us, our inner psychological aggregates, are beings that are also transforming and awakening, for example. But we use the word death because what happens is when we use the word integration, and we use the word transmutation, and there's a lack of understanding with the inner mysteries. What can happen is that we find that individuals will say, oh, I'm transforming my shadow into my light body. And what they do is they'll do work on the negative egos that they don't like, their negative qualities. And they think because they've changed their personality to have maybe a more sunny disposition or positive energy, which is just the other polarity of the ego. Rather, they shifted, right? They never actually removed or transmuted anything, because there's certain techniques to do that. And they think just because they, move from one side of the pendulum to the other, as we've talked about in other talks, that they've now transmuted their shadow and now they're a being of light, and they have actually done no work. So from what we found is that if someone is at the comprehension level of actually understanding what integration and transmutation entails, then they wouldn't have a problem with the word death, because they would understand that death doesn't actually mean death, because nothing actually dies. So sometimes it's better at an earlier stage to be a little bit more harsh, because we need to think a bit about it like that. Because in a sense, is while the ego doesn't die, that transformation process, it is like a person changing into a new person. But it's also, your personality doesn't disappear. You don't disappear. Like me as a child is now dead, and now I'm here as an adult. I have grown over that time frame. I've changed my understanding of the reality of the world, even in a horizontal line, in just a practical sense, in everyday sense. I now understand things differently than I did when I was in high school, for example. So high school me has died. That's how we use the word death in spirituality, because that's what death really means. Everything is eternal and always consistent in a spiritual sense.
It's constant. Yeah.
Yes. So it's really cyclical, and all that death is the end of one phase and the birth of another one, kind of like a chrysalis with a caterpillar becomes a butterfly. The caterpillar died, but did it? It became a beautiful butterfly. So that's why we use those words, and it's not meant to, it can scare the ego, but that's only because the ego knows that that's something that will make you see it and come after it. Whereas sometimes like the ego can change something like integration, if your understanding is low, to save itself. So it'll put fear in you of the teaching that talks about death, as it being too intense and harsh, or because it wants you to keep some of your egos. Really, your whole shadow is an amalgamation of a lot of egos, and we could look at it also as a multiplicity or a unity. So if it wants you to cleave off some and keep some of it, that's just self-preservation and trying to distract you, because it will sacrifice some of itself to remain the one driving your vehicle. Egos sometimes will go after each other in that sense, especially if they're like contradictory ones. But in the end of the day, it's still all one being. So it's just a distraction to keep you from actually seeing the attachment to the false sense of self.
Let's take, for example, someone who has a victim mindset, and they're always blaming everyone else except for seeing how they are the common denominator. The way that the shadow works, the way that the ego works, is that it sets up the scenarios, or we could say one part of it sets up the scenarios that another part of it is then going to be unhappy about. And hence why there's the teaching that it's a multiplicity, because the different parts and their different functions or programs are not necessarily in agreement. So they will chase after different outcomes, and these programs will be at odds with one another. So in the case of someone who is caught up in victimhood, let's say that they have this complaint that they're always getting fired. Well, first, when they go to a new job, there is a part of them that is just waiting to make the scenario where they will get fired. So it starts by being unpleasant and not getting along with all of the colleagues and the boss and the different workers in that environment. And then when this person comes home, then another part of the ego will arise and say, oh, so-and-so is terrible, so-and-so did this, so-and-so did that, and it will make sure to blame all of the individuals in the workplace so that the person doesn't see that they're the one who's causing all this discord. They'll think surely it's everyone else's fault. And without introspection and reflection, they won't discover this trick that they are playing on themselves. So eventually, this person gets fired because they can't get along, they can't work with anyone, and they think it's everyone else's fault. Well, now that they've gotten fired, then this next program is also confirmed. Oh, I'm always getting fired. Oh, people just don't value a good hard worker or a good employee these days. People don't recognize my value, and oh, I was underpaid, I was underappreciated, all of these comments. And the person continues with this story of victimhood, that everyone is out to get them, everyone is against them, everyone is difficult and terrible and always doing things that they don't like. But they don't realize that they're the one who is also contributing in a very specific way in order to give rise to those scenarios. So it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So we can understand that the ego is very clever and tricky, and because it is multifaceted and the different parts of the shadow come forward to play these different parts of the game, without a very good, disciplined, and honest method of going deep within, then there are people that can go their whole lives and not discover these shadow parts of themselves. But from this example, we can see that when we act from the shadow, whilst it does give the consciousness, the awareness, a very particular and specific kind of experience from which it can learn what it feels like to be in a program of victimhood, what it feels like to self-sabotage all of one's endeavors, what it feels like to always be the outcast by one's own making. So from all these scenarios, there is wisdom to be extracted. And it's not that we don't need to go through these kinds of experiences, these kinds of self-generated challenges. When we finally have exhausted this kind of a story, and we've finally begun to have gnosis, or we could say the ability to introspect with insight, we've begun to understand what exact part we play in all of these scenarios, rather than blaming or accusing or reacting. Then we're able to undertake a specific kind of change. And when we go through this change, we have a metamorphosis. We're able to shift this point of gravity, or this particular ego, into a new kind of way, into a new point within this multidimensional reality. So when we move this center of gravity through transmuting it to a slightly higher point of view, a point of view that is able to encompass more perspectives, we can say it's like a mini kind of awakening. Something had to die, which was the shadow, the part that was sabotaging, that was causing a lot of opportunities to be lost. And through the pain and the transformation, that growth is able to occur. And this person finally decides to surrender, to sacrifice and give up that shadow, that false sense of self, that thing that is not what they truly are, but what they felt so identified with. when they give it up and they transmute themselves into something a little bit lighter, of a slightly higher vibration, then suddenly all of the experiences around them will begin to change. And of course, this relates to one piece of the puzzle regarding coherence.
Yes, and that's an important part when it comes to freeing ourselves, that we need to understand that the salvation or the liberation that any religion talks about, this, the freedom of the consciousness, exists at the center. And it consists of, like anything else, a balance between two poles. And usually what we see in spiritual schools is that the schools will look at one of these poles and renounce the other one as something there's something wrong with. And thus we become identified with a method that either goes in one way or the other, or even a third way that maybe understands the essence of the unity and the awareness, but it's out of balance, where it doesn't say you should do any work with the duality at all, just complete non-doing, but non-doing in the sense of I'm not going to engage with the reality that I created to have an experience in. And all of these things become out of balance between the three forces, including the one that conciliates and pulls them together. So in the case of the transmutation of the ego and the integration of the ego into higher subtle bodies, we need to understand that no matter how much we awaken the consciousness, no matter how much we stay in the awareness of the center and perceive things clearly, that our physical bodies can't process higher vibrations without some type of development within spiritual matter. And the matter, in a physical sense, has already stopped developing at the humanoid, at the person. We're at the top of what nature can give us on this planet in a physical sense. So to develop those higher bodies, there is work that is done in initiatic schools, in schools of mysteries, to help us to purify our more higher subtle aspects of our vibration and body, to accept these vibrations slowly but surely as we start to connect to that spirit through the consciousness. But this can become what people call the soul trap, where we actually mistake those bodies or the higher aspect of us as the spirit itself, and we become either identified with it or we worship it or one of these types of things, and then there's still separation. What we need to understand is that in the center, and this is about finding the center, in the center all is one and there is no separation. So any type of separation, no matter what plane it's on, whether it's a lower ego, a higher ego, an ego from another galaxy, is some type of perspective that is slightly off the center, and thus creates separation between us and other beings. Even higher beings, right, aren't all the way back at unity. There's something that separates them. They're conscious, but they're not fully at unity. So to an extent, there are things that separate us at other levels. So we can't just assume because we are starting to connect to soul and these psychic abilities that just means that we're automatically awakened and there's nothing else for us to see. We always need to pull ourselves back towards the center, and that's what coherence is about. So both in our own mind, emotions, and our actions, but also within what we're focusing on with our methods of spirituality. We could say there's three different things that we work with spirituality, and mostly in between the two of them is what we'll see is that there's a duality in that sense between those three things, because one relates to the third force of conciliation, which is the awakening and understanding of the reality itself, and the other are the two poles of the work down here in this duality that manifest through both the intellect and the heart center. So that's why we said you have the pathways that can become very intellectual and stuck in the mind, or you could have a pathway that is stuck in the heart center and stuck in blind faith, and we worship something else. The other end of the spectrum is we begin to believe that we are God ourselves, and it is true in one aspect. Yes, we are a fractal of the divine spark, but it is our essence. It is our spark of spirit within, not us, the person, the lower ego. So when the lower ego takes claim of that and then gets knowledge about a whole bunch of things and magic and theurgy, it could use it as an excuse to do the will of the ego. So then we're in coherence, but we're in coherence with the ego, not at the center, because the ego is not at the center in an external macro sense. And the same thing token goes for if we make ourselves, say, obedient to a higher being and we give away all our autonomy to that. And in that sense, then again, we'll be in coherence with the higher self, but the higher self isn't necessarily also in the center. And that's where we get these terms in spirituality, the right-hand path and the left-hand path. These are beings that at their level of understanding haven't fully comprehended the lack of separation between the observer and the witness, and they either choose to they choose to identify as the witness or identify as the observer, or identify as a witness and subservience to the observer. But either way, that there's a separation between them, right? So whether it's a left-handed path where we need to be autonomous because the higher self is enslaving us, separation, right? It sees our higher bodies as another being that is tyrannical, or if it's a right-handed path where, we either, see ourselves, that we believe ourselves to be the being, and we think we're a genie of a planet, and we think that we're some type of powerful God, or on the other hand, we actually just think our being is that, and we're a miserable worm of the earth, and we just are subservient to this higher being that gives us psychic abilities. All of those things include separation. So at that point, we're still seeing subjectively, and we're not in the center of the reality, because at the center point, everything is one, even though we are in a dualistic manifestation. Then the third thing we talk about is if we're out of balance the other way, which is where we understand this unity and we want to just throw away the experience. And that comes from a sense of, well, if everything's illusion, why should we do the work? But that is another way that the ego separates us. We think, oh, I understand unity, all is one, but what is it within us that doesn't want to contribute and work together with everyone else that's in the contract who's also us? There's an aspect of not just do we need to do the work in the matter to create the body or to prepare the body to accept higher forms of consciousness as we are actually growing, and to just be and exist is to grow, because we're growing infinitely into infinite space. But there's also the aspect of it's very selfish to just be like, well, I figured it out and I don't want to do anything. I don't want to help others. If you understood that others were actually you, not just intellectually, then that's the divine purpose. It is to awaken the consciousness and to help others awaken, because they also are me, right? If we truly had comprehension of that, it's not even a question in the psychology. It is the only choice. Nothing else matters on the horizontal line or in the illusion. The illusion, the purpose for it isn't to make money or to have a family or do any of that. It is to extract wisdom and grow the consciousness. So in that sense, if we understand that and we perceive the illusion, the Maya, for its actual purpose, which is to have this experience and extract wisdom, then the only purpose of being here is to awaken the consciousness and help others to awaken. And that would be at the center. And if you contacted that, then it would be a comprehension. It would be gnosis, a knowledge. You would understand that knowledge through that direct experience and wouldn't have to have any resistance to that idea, right? The resistance is from the separation in the ego itself. So that's the sweet spot of the center that we want to find in coherence between spirit, soul, and body in a macro sense. But again, we start first with just our actual thoughts, our emotions, and our will, connecting our will to our authentic self.
Yes, little by little.
Yes.
Let's talk about some of the ways that on the level of the individual, we can be not in coherence. So we mentioned one of them is where we are acting in service of the shadow. And there's another big one that is often expressed in a particular way that kind of gets it right to the best that one could without having a larger context. So this is something that is said a lot. A lot of people say, I just need to get it off my chest, or I just need to speak my truth. I just needed to be authentic to myself. And that's good. That's something very important. And we're talking about a coherence usually between the emotions and our actions, where let's say somebody is making you feel very bad, but you allow them to continue to mistreat you, for example. And the moment when you stand up, you hold your own and you set a boundary, or you no longer participate with them, then you've done the right thing and you've acted in accordance with how you were feeling. So it's a kind of coherence. The problem arises when oftentimes these emotions that we feel are coming from the shadow. So yes, it's not good to let somebody walk all over you or bully you or make you a victim, something like that, or even have a kind of violence towards you. Of course, you should defend yourself. And if you're in a situation that is unsafe, by all means, get out, right? That's a given. But what happens when we act from the shadow? Let's take an example where somebody is not respecting us in a certain way. So maybe they don't use certain honorific titles, or they don't know how what a good musician we are, or something like that. Something that we've imagined about how we should be treated that essentially is going to feed our ego, right? So we think, I'm so important and I'm so superior, and surely you should know that I'm a good musician, or I'm a good singer, or a painter, or whatever, and or I have this much in net worth, I have all of these properties, I have all of these cars. Now, don't you know who I am? Why don't you treat me in such and such a way? I'm not sure if all of the people from these examples might be watching this video, but it's an example of where we might have a very inflated view of who we are, or certain expectations that we imagined that we want from someone else. And when they don't do that, when they don't speak to us a certain way that we imagined is what we deserve, that can sometimes be over the top, if they don't do certain special extra things that we thought would be so nice, for example, they forgot to call me on such and such a day, or their birthday wishes were late, they didn't open the door for me, something like that, we can get very upset and very absorbed in ourself and use this to accuse the other person. And then we think, okay, I've got to tell them off, and they're wrong, and now I'm being authentic, I'm honoring how I feel, and this is my truth. So we created a kind of coherence in that we allowed our actions to follow our emotions, but our emotions were being informed by another program, by another part of the shadow, by illusion, by imagination. So if we expect our spouse to give us a box of chocolates on Valentine's Day and they give us flowers instead, how rude. How could they, right? We have all these kinds of things that we imagine. Or a common one is, we invited the Smiths over for dinner and they didn't invite us back. How rude. They've been downgraded to horrible people, and they are not following the normal social programs that I expected of them. Well, we're in a multicultural world these days, and people have different ways of being and doing. Not everything is always going to match up perfectly with what we expect. Even the ways that we express love and care and attention can be vastly different. So for us to project a particular expectation based on our own culture, our own upbringing, or even the people on our street, how things were in our neighborhood, and to expect that from someone else, not understanding their unique challenges, their unique culture and background and influences and so on, it's not only not realistic, but it's very self-centered. And if we behave in this way, we're going to cause ourselves a lot of grief. So it's a kind of coherence, but with allegiance to the shadow and these programs that are based around being very self-centered and separate. Now, the other extreme of this is where we have this program of expectations, which we're unconscious, so we're unaware of it. And we understand enough to know that if I just go around saying, how could you not do such and such a thing, that we're going to alienate everyone. So what is the other side where we're also not in coherence is where we suppress, right? We build up a lot of resentment and we hold all of these feelings in and thoughts, and we make all of these stories about how the other person is the bad guy. Resentment is such a dangerous thing for our own health, both physically and spiritually. It causes massive decoherence in the field. It blocks up our chakras, and it can cause long-term physical ailments. So we know that resentment is something that is not going to be beneficial for an individual, and yet people do it. And that's why there's that common recommendation to be authentic, speak your truth. Because in a way, even though we could say in a lot of scenarios both are egoic and selfish, the one or the option where we speak our truth and we get it off our chest, we at least allow some steam to come out. We allow some energy to stop being blocked up, because all of manifestation is a movement. It's a flow of energy. What would be the third option? How could we remain coherent and also work on our shadow? Well, we might not do either of those things all of the time, but we may need to take more time to reflect, to go within, and to identify how is my shadow playing into these scenarios. Are perhaps my expectations unrealistic and unreasonable? Am I being self-centered? And it's not to say that you don't need new friends. Maybe you do. But unless we learn this lesson, we'll find that we will be in a scenario where we attract the same kinds of friends because we haven't learned to stop being self-centered and to demand specific things. If we are truly in a place of love and mutual give and take, then everything happens very organically. There isn't scorekeeping, but there isn't any particular side taking advantage of the other. And when we vibrate in that way, we will attract those who vibrate in the same way. So no one in that scenario would be worrying about scorekeeping or who's taking advantage of who, because that's not something that exists in the psychology of those people that can be in a happy place together without judging each other or trying to take advantage of one another. So the work on the shadow in this scenario is very important, that it be transmuted into one that is more balanced, that it be transmuted into a point of gravity that is less selfish and demanding and self-centered. And the anchor that can take us through that process but keep our field as coherent as possible is the ability to be mindful, to be equanimous, to be with the breath, to completely relax, and to realize and recognize when our thoughts and emotions are getting out of control, they're getting carried away with endless stories, and to come back to the breath, come back to the present moment. Because if we allow those stories and those internal torturings of our psychology to continue, then we perpetuate that decoherence in our field. So it's not to say that we need to have all the answers or heal all of our traumas tomorrow. We can address these little by little. And in the meantime, we don't want to feed them or allow them to get worse. So instead of telling stories and gossiping and pointing the finger, we come back to the present moment. We be with the body, we be with the breath, we be in the here and now, and we just say, I'm willing to drop it. I drop all of those stories, all of those things. Then later on we can take them into meditation and have some contemplation regarding them.
Yeah. The thing with Coherence too is it makes you think about the teaching of the fourth way from Gurdjieff, or if we want to look at a more modern teaching, I think Eckhart Tolle kind of talks in a more modern sense about the same kind of aspect. In a macro sense, right, we could actually say what I said before about like the right hand path, the left hand path, and truth, or order, chaos, and truth, or the non-dual teaching, right? That's the true fourth way in the middle for spirit. But it's like Jesus said to Nicodemus, let that be a spirit, and what is of flesh is of flesh. We have to do the work in both. The true balance is between the spirit and the matter, which is why we're here. And in that sense, if we're working to start doing the work in the matter with the physical body and to prepare it for spiritual things, this starts with what we would say is a teaching that we would say is a fourth way teaching, and it's to start working in balance. Because if we work out of balance, out of coherence, too much to one way or other, like we said, we have these issues where we don't create these bodies in a totally pure way, and can cause us troubles later on and strengthen egos. Because if we awaken through conditioning, that is possible, but we strengthen the conditioning that we didn't see to do it. So if we use a method that we're using some type of willpower or an abuse of the emotional center, an abuse of the intellect, even though maybe we get rid of a lot of our shadow and we free up a lot of consciousness, the little bit of that we used through the attachment to method or the attachment to tools gets strengthened over the time, because there is a lot of energy work that comes in working with the initiatic schools and transmutation and integration and the purification process. But basically what the fourth way is to take a balanced approach to working with all three of our centers in our physical body, well, our lower quaternary or physical, emotional, mental bodies, but the body that make up our lower person, and working with them in coherence. So it both is, or I guess it's three things, not both, but it entails first purifying the energy of the physical body itself, and really getting our physical body into shape to be able to do the spiritual work and to be in a more positive health aspect. Then we have the work in our heart center to balance our emotions so that we are emotionally unstable. And then as well as at the same time, the works in meditation to retake control of the mind back to the consciousness and not having the mind control us. Because really the mind is our most useful tool. It is why we can even analyze and process and even are at the ability of being able to awaken consciousness, say, compared to our dogs or our cats, who also have consciousness within them but don't have the intellect yet to be able to perceive what is necessary to start connecting to the higher aspect. So, which is all a stage of evolution. We've evolved to a point where the intellect allows us to actually connect to the consciousness. But now it still is at the forefront because we're identified with it, and it has actually become our biggest enemy to connecting with the consciousness. So both through training and quieting the mind, learning to remember our heart center, which is where the seat of our soul is, to help us also really truly connect to our higher self. A lot of the times, because we've become so intellectual in modern times, especially in Western culture, it's that we completely neglect using the heart center altogether. And then, of course, cleansing the body so that the energy flows properly, so that we have the energy to build up the things that we need to do, both in the heart center and the mind as well, and eventually connecting our body to its higher subtle aspects. So these three things need to be done in coherence and in tandem. And that is what we would consider a teaching as a fourth way. So there are many teachings out there. There are even teachings that will claim to be fourth way teachings, but we really want to look for this aspect that none of these things are de-emphasized. You know, people might say something like this, but if, for example, there's not an encouragement of meditation or prayer or work with the energy, right? All three of those things are important. So it shouldn't be focused on one thing over the other two, and vice versa. That's something that we need to pay attention to. Because there'll be some schools that will mention all of these things and say they're all necessary, but then expect you to say, you know, do mostly just prayer or worship and blindly follow someone, right? There may be other ones that, say that, yes, sure, you have to purify the heart center, but they're totally focused on only meditating like 10 hours a day and don't really do that much prayer, even though they mention that you should do it, right? And even in then, the teaching is there. Is also some of the, remember, we're responsible for our own work. So if we do have a teacher that say, gives us all those three options, and maybe they themselves focus one way or another as a guide because that's their path, then it's okay for us to understand that for us, we need to balance those things as well. And not necessarily, it may not be a problem with the teaching. It just might be someone's interpretation is different than yours is. And if you feel the need to be more centered and balanced and do more of, say, prayer or energy work when it's being neglected, say, in a setting from your guide or your teacher, then that's okay. Because in the end of the day, a guide is a guide, not someone that we worship or follow blindly. The point is to establish the coherence so that we connect to our own inner frequency, and then we connect to our own inner master, our own essence, which then we hear from source, and we enter the school in the internal planes, which we can actually experience, and we become our own teacher. So that is the goal of any school. It shouldn't be the school, no school as a vehicle, no method as a vehicle can help us awaken the consciousness to the point of depersonalization and disidentification. The only way to truly find freedom and liberation and salvation is to find that unique frequency on your own. The tools and the methods are simply just a vehicle to help us find balance when we're out of balance. Usually in today's society, we're very out of balance, usually towards we would say is the left, in the
towards
sense
the
of,
ego.
Yeah, we're towards the lower ego, the majority of people on this planet. So we're very towards the lower ego, and we're out of balance that way and towards individuality. So we usually wanted to pick up some type of spiritual teaching that is related to the right-handed path, and that will help us start to give us the practices to start to help us balance our internal state. But we don't want to get obsessed with that, and we need to be always under the constant self-observation, because this all comes back to is self-observation. We need to observe and see our false sense of self for what it truly is, because only through comprehending it can we see it for the illusion that it is and truly find the unity, not just through mystical experience, but find it and hold that frequency because we've now comprehended it and connected to it. So that even though the ego is still there and we're still in this physical form, we are now resonating at the frequency of the unity that is all of us.
And that's something that can take many lifetimes, but we want to get closer to it as we can, little by little. I like what you said about how the practical aspect of, okay, we know we need to be coherent, but then what? What do we do, right? Okay, we can do some work on the ego, so we make sure that we are acting from our authentic will, not the will of the shadow, or what has also been called the divine will, the higher will, whatever terminology you like. And then what do I do about my emotions and my thoughts? Some common complaints people have is I'm overthinking, or I go to quiet my mind and it doesn't become quiet, or I'm very moody. 1 minute I'm very happy and then I'm very sad. If we look at the Buddhist and Eastern teachings, there's a lot about training to be equanimous. And that's why the Buddha gives the teachings about how everything is impermanent. When we understand that everything is impermanent, that everything is in a constant flux, a constant change, it's all going through cycles, then we can see how useless it is to try to grasp onto things. If we have a good friendship with a very good dear friend, one day that's going to end. We don't know how, but either the friends will have falling apart in their rapport, they could have some argument, they might go into different interests, one might move away, or eventually one of them, and of course eventually both of them, will pass away. So we can see even something very lovely like a good bond between friends is not forever. And the same thing applies to a good meal. going to a concert, or even getting together with your spiritual friends to have a spiritual activity. None of these things last. When we truly comprehend impermanence, a lot of the clinging to material things begins to fall away, and even the immaterial things like the good feeling of being together with friends, for example, or a particular reputation. A reputation can go up and it can fall down, and usually when someone has a scandal or their reputation is ruined, it happens very fast. And so they see how fickle, how much of an illusion all of those things were that existed inside of the psyche, inside of the psychology of the individuals involved in that particular story. So when we know that nothing is permanent, another teaching that can help us is understanding that our grasping leads to pain. And usually this comes from our own life experiences. When you try to explain this to a young person, it's a lot harder because they haven't experienced their first heartbreak, or not finding the career that they hoped for, not being able to render or manifest all of these dreams, these illusions that they have as a young person. They're very hopeful. And as they go through life, just go and find someone towards the sunset years. And unless they are a very good meditator, or they're in some kind of school of philosophy or spirituality, there's someone who's made a particular investment in training and cultivating a positive or balanced demeanor and outlook, you'll find that a lot of those in the sunset years are not happy after they've gone through the whole journey of life, starting with the dreams and hopes they had as a young person, and then going through and finding that never once was the actuality a perfect match of what they expected or what they hoped for. They had a dream of a family, and then maybe it fell apart, maybe they didn't get along, or whatever it was. It didn't match the fantasy. It didn't match all of these ideals that they had. And even if it does, for a fleeting moment, then it also passes. So we understand what the Buddha taught, that grasping or clinging to events leads to pain. And we have these two poles that cause our suffering, which are craving and aversion. A lot of people in spirituality have heard this before, so they might understand this, or you might understand this intellectually. When we comprehend it very deeply, then we start to peel back, not from engaging with life physically, but from trying to extract sensation and highs from life, because we realize that it doesn't deliver in that way. Whatever goes up needs to come down. And when we have this realization and we begin to build, for example, a meditation practice or daily mindfulness, and we begin to be more and more present, we realize that this is okay. This is the truth. So we're not expecting the reality to deliver something that it can't. We're not fighting against the present moment. This is how we balance our emotions, by not demanding these highs which lead to the lows. It's the swing of a pendulum. If you go far this way, you're going to have the rebound. So when we chase these moments when we're very, very excited and in extreme excitement physically, then we're going to have these low days when we're depressed and we feel like, oh, my friends have gone home now and nothing is happening, I'm bored. And because we're not reflective, what do? We quickly, immediately turn on the TV so that we don't have to be with ourselves and be with the gnosis that was just one step away from us discovering how the reality works, how the emotions swing like a pendulum. So we can take up a practice that can allow us to train the emotions so that they're not always swinging through these extremes. It doesn't mean we don't have emotions, And it doesn't mean that we go hide in a cave somewhere and we don't visit with our friends and take part in these normal householder activities. By all means, we can, but the way that we relate to them can be different. The first is that we're not trying to extract a sensation or a high from them. You can keep doing this and you will keep getting disappointed until you decide that enough is enough and that it doesn't deliver in that way, and that it's okay to interact with the reality from a calm and balanced position. That's how we train our equanimity. We understand what is the reality, we remove the expectations, and we take a meditation practice. The meditation will assist us to balance the emotions and also the thinking mind. Now, the problem with overthinking can be resolved in a few ways. The first way is we need to become mindful throughout the day. If we are mindful in all of our activities, when the mind starts to churn and make these stories, these accusations about how so-and-so is a bad guy, immediately we catch it and we drop it, so we don't continue in this pattern. That's the first thing. The second thing, it relates to a teaching regarding karma, that the busyness of the mind comes from past misperceptions of the reality, where we engaged in the reality in an egoic or self-centered way because we didn't perceive that we were a unity. We got lost, we got confused, we fell asleep, however you want to describe it. In those key moments, we did something that caused our energy, our own energy field, to become out of balance. So the return is all of those thoughts, or we could call them egos, these little mini bubbles inside the awareness that are coming back as a result of these past decoherent actions. It's a kind of pendulum. And what that means is, if we think of all of our past actions that were many, many since we were born, and if you take the view of former existences, then we can say, let's include those as well, though that's another topic. Then we have many, many past actions that were what in Buddhism would be called wrong action. And those actions, or those instances of decoherence, need to find a way to play out, to resolve. And so they come into the mind with stories, accusations, odds against life, and so on. So the more we clean up our actions and act from a place that is selfless, that is living in a correct and upright manner, that is not selfish and self-centered, and that does kind, good things for others without making it about us, not calling attention like, oh, look, I donated this money, oh, I did all these things, making it a kind of egoic activity. If we don't do that, we begin to correct how we are living, then this will also contribute to the mind becoming more and more quiet and easier to calm down, because we will have less of those little bubbles that come from the wrong action.
Yeah. I would say that one thing also to give, and maybe this will be helpful, it'll be a little bit more advanced depending on if someone has a little bit of skill with meditation already, but not too difficult. So just basic meditation. I'd say basic aptitude. Yes, that's a good word. Aptitude would probably help with this. And it's basically, Ruth is talking about preparing ourselves in the waking life to be able to have gnosis, or direct experience. And direct experience in meditation usually comes from what we like to call contemplation, which is a stage of concentration. It is when we are concentrating so heavy we unify with something in spirit itself. So whatever it is we're concentrating on. And in this case, this is how we observe and eventually see an ego, or even our entire false sense of self, or another object for what it truly is and the true nature of it, and we see the objective reality around it. I just wanted to give a little quick tips on to how to hopefully get into contemplation, and it would just be a concentration technique, and it'll take time as we focus our concentration and we go through the stages of concentration. Eventually it should lead to meditation and contemplation. So depending on what you prefer, you could use a question, or you could use an affirmation, but really what we want to do is either ask ourselves, are we in balance, or are we coherence, or what coherence is, perhaps, maybe. Or we could use an affirmation if we prefer that. We could say, I am in coherence, right? Something along those lines. And concentrate on that once we get into a meditative state, and we concentrate on that. And first, we go through the stage of looking at it through the intellect and some analysis. We don't want to get stuck here. A lot of people usually get stuck in analyzing, but we do want to, just go through the thoughts of what it is to us that what we think it is, what we think balance is, what does it look like to us when we are in balance, right? We want to have a baseline, right? So those are all the perspectives that we already understand about it, and nothing more. Don't go down the rabbit hole. Don't become identified with it. For example, if we're using a question, don't become identified with it and try to answer the question. That's not the point. Just what we think the answer is, and that's good enough. And because the next thing we want to move into is how we feel about it, and we want to sit with how it feels to be in coherence. And in that sense, if we run through the intellectual perspectives of the mind that we have with something, and eventually if we sit with it long enough with feeling, eventually we should come to a place of contemplation where we become one with the question that we're asking, or the affirmation that we are making. And that is manifestation, is the union of our spirit, our essence, with that which we are observing. And in that sense, with that union with the coherence, we have comprehension of what coherence is. And then also thus, if in the moment, let's say something in the day was bringing us out of balance, by just sitting with it there and the comprehension of what that is, we should bring our frequency into that balance. And this also works with how we identify ego. This is how we were to disidentify from our false sense of self at some point eventually. But first we need to be balanced before we can tackle that. That's a lot harder to sit with our pains and traumas, of course. But this is how we approach truly observing and becoming one with something, so that we have the comprehension of what that is, whether it's something outside of us or inside of us. And in this case, if we could get to that state, it will help bring ourselves back into balance when we've been out of balance from a day of just taking in impressions. Depending on where you live, right? You might be in a place, we are in New York City, for example. There's lots of impressions. You're constantly getting bombarded. That's a way to center yourself. And it's an easy practice to, once you've already contacted it and already know what that feels like, and you have comprehension of what the balance is, to then sit and center yourself. It wouldn't even take too long, about as long as it would take you to get into a meditative state. So this is a way that we can work towards that balance, as well as a way that's not a lot of steps, are not very difficult. It just takes practice. Concentration literally just takes practice. At first, we'll only be in that first stage where we need to concentrate and just be able to concentrate on what we're thinking without the mind running loose. And then once we get past that stage, you'll be able to sit there and feel all the perspectives. So it's not something that maybe happens in one sit for you if you haven't been able to conquer those stages. But as we sit with that and we work on our concentration, over time, little by little improve. And we can use that same technique, not just to balance ourselves, but also eventually for our work in observing ourselves and seeing our unconscious and subconscious.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And you can start with a small practice, 10, 20 minutes a day, and then build up from there. We can't be afraid to start where we're at. It can be easy to hear these descriptions and then feel like, oh, that's very advanced. And then what happens? Our self-doubt and our insecurities begin to arise, and they say, oh no, I'll never be able to meditate like that, and that's too difficult, that's for monks. But if we start now, and time is going to pass anyway, if we start investing time in a daily practice that is one of the best ways that we can begin to train our field to become coherent. It's not necessarily going to happen overnight. We've had many, many years of being out of balance, of being incoherent, whether we were not honoring our truth or the needs of our soul, or whether we were egoically demanding things that never could be. All of these kinds of internal tortures have been our baseline, or for a lot of people have been the baseline for a long time. So if we think of it that way, we can understand that it's going to take some time to reverse that process, to undo it. But surely it is possible and it is doable if we take the first step. So I would say that that would be a very important key takeaway in how to tie all of this together, the practical aspect of it, that we understand that coherence is something necessary. It's something that can radically change how we interact with the reality and how events unfold around us. And the way to get there is by having a very solid meditation practice that we develop over time. And then, of course, being aware in the moment to understand when we are falling out of coherence. But there is something else I wanted to talk about, because we talked about what coherence is. We talked about the shadow and understanding the ego and how to transmute it. We didn't talk too much about the benefits of coherence. So why don't we talk about that a little bit?
Okay. Well, like,
just briefly.
Yeah, as we said, to be in coherence and in balance is the way that we create in the reality itself. Whether that is, that's why we added the aspect of will at the beginning of the talk, because whether that is in a sense of an egoic manifestation or a manifestation that is balanced and in the center, then that's one aspect of it. That's our internal coherence, right? Then when we talked about the external coherence, the reason why it's so important to be in the center and balance and make sure that the will is authentic and not coming from the ego is because of the karma dharma, which you briefly mentioned a little bit earlier. So when we create out of balance, then that creation is under the rules of cause and effect. So if I create something out of ego, whether it's through the positive force or the negative force, it creates an equal and opposite reaction that will then come back to me, and there has to be a payment made. So in that sense, we want to create out of the center and in the middle and create dharma. And if we create from a place that's dharmic, we will then acquire energy and things like that.
Yes. So whilst there's a lot more that we could say on this, this is a good introduction to allow some of you to get started with training and correcting your energy field so that it comes into alignment. And with consistent daily work to calibrate it, then you should be able to remain in coherence, and then you should be able to have your fullest and most authentic expression that is unique to you.
So to correct that, I didn't mean dharmic. I meant in the sense that it's not karmic. So when we create out of the center as a perfect balance, there's no effect from the cause because we've created from a balanced place. Dharma is related to different energy. Yes.
Okay, very good. So we'll close this by saying, be the light, be the change you want to see.
Yes. And resonate at a higher frequency and maximize Dharma for the collective. Love and light.
We'll see you next time.